The problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil.
All right, folks, we're back. We've got Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, one more time. In this video, we're going to be watching and commenting on the recent video that was published on Alex O'Connor's channel, where Dr. William Lane Craig went on and they discussed the Canaanite issue. It was a really interesting conversation. It was also extremely provocative in the sense that the subject matter is very intense, and it's one of those really, really tough passages in the Bible that I think needs every bit of historic context and every bit of good philosophy in order to navigate through this. And so I've invited Michael Jones on the channel today to get some of his thoughts. I would like to share some of my own, and we're just going to play the clip out, pause it, and talk through it. So let's do it, Michael.
All right, yeah, I'll go ahead and play it now.
Between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second, in this case, would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other, because God wrongs no one in issuing such a command. And if he wrongs no one, then there is no moral constraint on his issuing such a command.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument for the existence of God, you might appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that to construct an argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Rouser points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. And as long as this ethical theory is possible and coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good and all loving and his issuing a command of this sort. In the absence of a divine command, as I say, it could well have been immoral. But given the presence of divine command, it becomes the moral obligation of those persons to whom it was issued. Now, so it doesn't undermine our moral intuitions about what's right and wrong. It just introduces the qualification of a divine command.
But it would mean that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with taking the life of an innocent child. Nothing intrinsically wrong with
Well, again, this is going to depend on your moral theory, Alex. I think that right and wrong, moral obligations, are determined by imperatives issued by a qualified authority. And so in the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right and wrong. It's a subjective illusion of human consciousness. And I think this is one of the real problems of atheism, is that lacking a moral lawgiver and moral authority, it has no basis for affirming objective right and wrong. These are just either patterns of behavior that have emerged from the sociobiological pressures of the evolutionary process, or else they're expressions of personal preference and taste. In neither case, then, are they normative. So, in the absence of a moral authority to issue these imperatives, there wouldn't be any objective right or wrong. But given such a divine moral lawgiver, there is objective right and wrong, but that moral lawgiver himself doesn't have the same moral obligations that we do.
I suppose if I'm being asked to accept wholesale a biblical morality, I suppose I would look at something like this and, as Lincoln said of slavery, think, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I mean, maybe I can't make a moral claim. Maybe I can't say that there is such thing as morality and immorality in the universe, but something inside of me tells me that if there is such thing as ethics, it can't look like this. In other words, you're asking me, in order to accept the justification for the actions in this story, to deny one of the most forceful moral intuitions, the exact kind of moral intuition which you might ask me to rely upon in other contexts to establish God's existence at all.
So let me stop there with Alex before Craig jumps in there. Regardless of the debate they're having, I don't think innocent children were killed in the conquest. I think we've misread these texts. This is something I've talked about in my series on the Exodus. Okay, so K. Lawson Younger Jr., okay, great Old Testament scholar, he says, while there are differences, the Hebrew conquest account of Canaan in Joshua 9-12 is by and large typical of any ancient Near Eastern account. So Joshua sounds like an ancient Near Eastern war conquest. Well, if we go and read some of those, we find something interesting. So the stele, the Gebel Barkol stele of Tutmosis III says this: the great army of Mitanni, it is overthrown in the twinkling of an eye. It has perished completely. Say that again. It has perished completely, as though they never existed, like the ashes of a fire. Okay, Tutmosis III fought the Mitanni Empire. They did not perish completely. His son Amenhotep II made a treaty with them, so they're obviously still around and have a standing army. This is ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. We see this in the Merneptah stele. This is the earliest inscription that mentions Israel. It says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. Okay. Again, ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It's saying these were completely wiped out. They weren't. It's just saying they're defeated with strong language. The Mesha inscription mentions Israel. It says, Israel has utterly perished forever. Okay, that obviously was false. Mesha did not utterly wipe out Israel and leave behind no Jews. They obviously were still there. This is just ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole. Sennacherib says, the soldiers of Hirame, I think that's how you say that, dangerous enemies, I cut down with a sword and not one escaped. Okay, so we see this throughout. Nicholas Warterstorff says in Divine Evil, he says, we can call it a hagiographic account of Joshua's exploits. The book is not to be read as claiming that Joshua conquered the entire promised land, nor is it to be read as claiming that Joshua exterminated with the edge of the sword the entire population of all the cities on the command of Yahweh to do so. K. Lawson Younger Jr. says in his book, Ancient Conquest Accounts, if scholars had realized the hyperbolic nature of the account of Joshua, if they had compared it with other ancient Near Eastern accounts of complete conquest, the image of the conquest as represented in Joshua would have emerged in a far clearer focus than it is. So what is it basically saying? It's basically saying they came in and they utterly defeated their enemies. They wiped them out. It was like no one was left, even though there were. And we see this in Joshua 10:20. It says, when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, comma. Then it says, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities. Wait a minute. I thought the first part of the verse said they were wiped out. And now you're talking about a remnant. Exactly. Because when we see in Joshua's conquest about everyone being wiped out, every man, woman, and child, that's hyperbole. Richard Hess talks about this in his commentary on the book of Joshua, when it talks about Jericho, everyone being wiped out, every man, the woman, the young to old. It's not saying they literally wiped out babies. It's just saying this exhaustively, they were defeated and they sent them running. They killed all the warriors or anyone who stood against them. Again, I do not think Joshua's conquest meant they literally committed genocide and they wiped out babies. I think this is just ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole, and this is supported by the text of Joshua. You get to Joshua 23. What does it say? Well, we read, so it says, verse 9, for the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to a fight 1,000, since the Lord your God fights with you as he promised. Be careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Okay, obviously, many of the nations are still there. They're able to continue producing because it says, hey, don't marry with them. Okay, we see also this in the first 2 chapters of Judges. A lot of the Canaanites are still there. So this is not about wiping people out. This is about Israel coming in, getting rid of the evil culture that did child sacrifice and cultic prostitution, and taking over and replacing it, that kind of thing. And we also see this in the book of Joshua. Rahab, for example, says, hey, I'll join with Israel. I'll help Israel. And she's spared. There's also a city as well that joins with Israel and they're spared. It's not this idea they were just supposed to literally commit absolute genocide. I think we have just interpreted these texts in modern lenses, not in the ancient Near Eastern context, and see as hagiographic hyperbole.
Okay, so I've heard Dr. Copan talk about this idea as well, and he's used a couple of verses where it's like, get rid of all the women and then also don't marry them. And it's kind of to prove your point. It doesn't fully add up. He talks about ancient Near Eastern trash talk and some of these similar ideas, which I'm open to that interpretation to some extent. But here, I guess would be just a clarifying question is, for me, that works in some of the descriptions of what took place. But when it comes to something where it's God himself talking and he's giving a command, you guys do this. If it's just, in other words, if you kind of bring that idea to the table, it doesn't really say what it sounds like it says, then isn't that also kind of opening up a huge problem of, well, what else then that God said isn't really what he said, or what is it about this that we should read that way versus the rest of the Bible? To me, it kind of opens up this crack in the sense of undermining the reliability of being able to trust that the text is saying what it says. Now, to be clear, I understand very much so that there's different genres in the Bible, and if you're reading Revelation, you shouldn't read it the same as if you're reading the Gospel of John. So I'm totally with you there. I just think that, well, I guess I would just want to push into that for a second to get your response to the idea of if it's sort of a quotes from God saying, kill the children. How is that not a slippery slope?
Well, it's not a slippery slope because God can also use the language we use to communicate to us. So in like Jeremiah 12, he tells Jeremiah, if you've raced with men on foot and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? Do we think he's telling Jeremiah, you're going to be racing horses soon? No, he's talking about, hey, you've been given tasks and you're wearied, but I have bigger tasks for you to do. So you better man up and get ready because there's more coming. He can use hyperbolic language, metaphors as well. Jesus does this. He says, get the log out of your eye before you get the speck out of someone else's eye. He's going to use the language of the day to communicate to the people of the day. God in the Pentateuch can do the same thing. He can use that type of language, and they understood it. And Paul Copan talks about this in his book, Did God Command Genocide? He actually addresses the very point and notes that in the context of those verses being used, they're always used in sort of like a way to talk about the hyperbolic aspect of driving them out of the land. So it's being used in that similar kind of way. So I don't think God is, we have to put him in a box and say he can only speak to or command things literally. I mean, if he told me, I need you to get to the hospital. Like, let's say God appeared to me and said, get to the hospital now, get in your car and drive down that road. I need you to fly. I'm not going to sprout wings. He's using the word fly to say, go fast. I think he can do the same thing with the ancient Israelites.
Or I guess to support your point, I am the door. I am,
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Now I'm thinking here, maybe for the sake of time, I can because I didn't expect you were going to say what you just said, but this is actually interesting. This is putting me on the fence here in a good way. I'll just tell you, this conversation continues. Dr. Craig does not take that approach. Dr.
No.
Craig takes the approach of saying that basically because God commanded it, it is moral. And he takes a more literal approach, like the children really did die. And it leads into an interesting discussion where Alex O'Connor basically says, well, wait a second, isn't that one of those things that y'all Christians use to support the idea of universal objective morality? Isn't that just the type of example that you would use to talk about our shared moral intuitions? Because it's so obviously immoral. But now here you're saying God said to do it, and therefore, by definition, it is moral since God is the source of all good. Now, so this is now a little bit more philosophical and less textual, but I wanted to, given that you are a philosopher, as far as I understand, I wanted to run this idea by you to get your thoughts on if you think that this is legit, or if you would push back on this, or what your response would be to this type of dilemma for the people who aren't willing to do what you just did and who are actually going to go ahead and face this in a more literalistic way. This is what I was thinking about.
So it's a good question.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
it's a good question. So here's a common question that you'll get in philosophy school. Like, if you had a time machine, but you could only go back to like when Hitler was a baby, would you kill Hitler? Would you kill baby Hitler? I mean, that actually comes up in the second Deadpool movie in the post-credit scene. Like, he goes back in time and can he kill baby Hitler kind of thing. It's one of those things. But it's a serious question to ask if you're going to look at this from a philosophical perspective. If you kind of go back in time, do you think it'd be the moral thing to kill baby Hitler or not? What is your thought?
Personally, I think it's obvious. Yes. And I would go farther. I would say it would also be more moral to kill Hitler and his family if he prevented the Holocaust.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of people fall, especially utilitarians. I honestly do not know the right answer because I'm a virtue ethicist. And so it's hard for me to make that kind of decision if that is the right thing. However, based on your normative ethical framework, it very well could be the right decision. So what's lacking in this conversation is, what is the actual normative ethical framework that we should have? Should we have a utilitarian framework where it's like the good is causing the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people? And so, like, you could make a case from it if you're going to be a utilitarian that, yeah, maybe actually from God's perspective, wiping out certain babies in this instance would be good because it's going to cause more happiness in the long term for greater number of people. If utilitarianism is true, you could make that case. It's much harder, though, if you're going to make it from a deontic case. So I'm pretty sure Dr. Craig is a deontologist. So, excuse me. So moral good for them is certain universal rules or universal laws that we have to hold to regardless. Like, it's always wrong to rape. It's always wrong to lie. This is, something that was proposed to Immanuel Kant. Like, the idea, what if an axe murderer shows up at your house and politely asks you to point him in the direction of your family so he can kill them? Of course, how would you respond, Immanuel Kant? Because you can't lie to him. So what do? So there's another instance where then it becomes, okay, is it an objective universal command to never kill an innocent life? And I think Dr. Craig is rejecting that as a deontology. So then it becomes a question, what are the deontic rules that we have to follow to be moral or to be ethical? So what's missing in this, I think, is trying to lay down what is the actual normative ethical framework. And you got to figure that out before you can figure out what is good and what is not good. It's hard to really have these kind of decisions because everyone's coming at this with emotions. They're not thinking about these underlying philosophical issues that have not been sorted out yet.
Yeah, and what Craig goes on to argue is that in terms of the normal ethical foundation, he basically goes on to say that God is the one person who can make these determinations, and we can know that in his omniscience, the correct moral choice is being made. And in other words, if God asked the Israelites to do this, we must then infer that it is the greatest possible moral good, which is something that I think was kind of lacking in terms of, to your point, it felt to me like the extreme emotional gravitas of this conversation was slightly lack was slightly unaddressed. And I sort of found myself wishing that Dr. Criag would have said, listen, can we all acknowledge this is horrific stuff that we're talking about? But if the only way to redeem humanity or save humanity, it's sort of like in Lord of the Rings, the entire mission is, on the edge of a blade. If we vary but a little, it will fail. If this particular action or commandment by God at a particular time was the only way to save the entire human species, with that context in view, does then something that would otherwise be immoral become, if directed by God, the, in a sense, lesser of two evils, or the actual moral way of threading the needle of humanity forward? They didn't totally get into that, but that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, is if you see things in that type of a way as well, or if you think that's bad philosophy or whatnot. I wanted to, because anyways, go ahead.
No, it's good philosophy because circumstances are very, very important for understanding ethical dilemmas. This is why virtue ethicists like myself don't like those, because you have like trolley examples. So like a trolley example is like trolley's coming down the train. You see one person tied up and you see four people tied up. The train is going to hit the four people, but you got a switch you can throw it to hit the one person. What do you do? And it's like, there are so many circumstances going into that situation that if it was actually in real life, it would be vastly different from person to time to circumstances to the people tied up. You just can't have this kind of hypothetical and know what is sort of moral from that. So you got to really look at circumstances here. So, if you got a circumstance like what you're talking about, like, so let's say like, that we, going back to the whole Hitler example, do we go back and actually kill Hitler to prevent the Holocaust? Like what if we actually knew from studying timelines that would actually make the world a better place? But there could be a case to be made that, yes, it's okay to kill baby Hitler at this point in time because you're going to save millions of lives. You're going to make the world a much better place in the long run. And so you could make that case in a virtue ethical framework or in a consequentialist framework. You could even make it in a deontic framework that somehow the circumstances make it so that the actual moral ought is that you have to act in this way. So there are those that need to be considered. You could also go back to Thomas Aquinas's view, which is called the doctrine of double effect. And this is an important thing to remember. So I have applied it to abortion in the past. So, what do you do if a woman is pregnant and you need to perform an abortion on her to save her life? So you're going to kill the child. Well, according to Aquinas' double effect, it can be the moral thing to do because you're having a double effect. You're not trying to kill the child, you're trying to save the mother, and inadvertently it's creating a double effect in that the child dies. So you could have that, you could take that doctrine double effect and apply it here. You're not trying to necessarily cause harm or bloodshed. You're trying to save humanity, I guess you could say, or create a timeline where there's far more joy and happiness. You could have that kind of rules. But again, my overall is I don't think there actually were children killed in the Canaanite conquest. I think that's hagiographic hyperbole.
For what it's worth, I got to say this just for the sake of my wife, who's a nurse practitioner. She would say, to be clear, that is never a real ethical dilemma that practitioners are faced with. A C-section is always a better choice. But for the sake of the philosophy, I can see where you're going with that. And when it comes to, this is something else that I wanted to add to this conversation, is that if you're granting the premise, which you have to in order to even have a problem, or even to even have this conversation at all, talking about the biblical God, you have to, it's assumed that this God is real, or else what are we talking about, right? So for the sake of this conversation, we're talking about the biblical God. And one of his character traits is that he's omniscient. And another one of his character traits is that he's ultimately, maximally, morally good. And so I think there's something else about that that's extremely important, is because I think if we were to watch the rest of this conversation, you could sort of see Alex applying human traits to God and then judging him according to the narrative of the book as if it were a human doing it. And I think that that's a really big mistake that people often make. This reminds me very much of the whole conversation about the problem of evil. If God is really good and really powerful and really loving, then why is the world the way that it is? And when I look at that, it's like, man, doesn't that assume that you know all future outcomes better than God? And you're saying there's no way that what we're living through right now could possibly be worth the good that it's going to produce for eternity. In order to go ahead.
We also would add, we also have to think God is on a whole other plane of existence. We really got to treat our plane of existence with God's plane of existence like the movie Inception. So we're like in different dream levels, because like, God is on a more real plane of existence, and this could just be like a dream from his perspective. Like, is it wrong to kill someone in a dream? We would go, well, no. In fact, in the movie Inception, sometimes it's the moral thing to do because you get them out of the dream and they get back to the real world. So like you could make the case that perhaps from God's perspective, him taking people out of this life is just moving them to a more real plane of existence. Now, again, I'm not saying that, that's the full picture. I'm just trying to give some more alternative ways to look at this, that you cannot judge God like he's just another human. It could very well be the case that, when we die, it's like waking up from a dream. And if that's the case, it's not the same as, in terms of planes of existence. God is on a different plane of existence. So different rules have to apply there. And so it's going to change things. Again, I'm not saying that's exactly analogous to what's going on here, but I'm just trying to give a little bit more broader perspective.
I've often thought of the analogy of labor, a woman giving labor, and the idea that if you were to look at that in just that narrow moment of time and you had no other context, you would easily say, this is a bad thing. It's bloody. It's horrific. She's screaming. She's in agony. It's filled with suffering. This is definitely, definitely bad. Mm-hmm. But when you have the context of what it produces and the life that it creates, and the joy that person is able to go on to have, it becomes obvious that that temporary affliction is preparing a weight of glory that is worth it. And I always think about that as just a way of kind of pushing against the problem of evil a little bit and saying, is it possible that there's something similar going on with the entire human experiment? Is it possible that it's like a labor that is bloody and horrific and does have evil at afoot within it, but is also a temporary snapshot compared to what it might be yielding eternally?
Yeah, and Eleanor Stump makes that case with the whole labor issue in her book, Wandering in Darkness. It's this idea that, if this stuff is totally evil, why do women choose to have natural births? Like, why? There's something else going on here that we need to consider when that's happening. Like, these women are choosing to suffer for something that's greater, a greater good that's going to come out of that.
There is a lot more to this conversation. However, for the sake of my card, for the sake of your time, I feel like this is a good little bit of, kind of engaging with the content. Is there anything else that you want to add based on what we've, watched so far within the conversation? Or do you want to play a little bit forward, or how do you want to go here?
No, we can stop here. If anyone wants more on like the problem of evil and suffering, I did a video called The Problem of Evil, the Christian Response. Then I did another video called The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response. And I talk about some ideas that might help in there.
Fantastic. I will put both of those in the description. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone go check out his channel. It's Inspiring Philosophy. I'm going to put it in the description. He does a lot of deep dive into subject matter in a way that's very different than what I do on this channel, but I think that our audiences would very much sort of appreciate what you're doing as well. So thanks again for coming on, and have a good one, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.